The weather was beautifully sunny. The sun was shining through the thick foliage of the trees. The young woman was returning home from another city where she had been studying for 3 years. Julia was born into a very well-to-do family. Her father was in business and her mother was a violinist and worked in the Philharmonic Hall all her life. Her parents often wondered why their daughter was nothing like them at all. She had almost no serious hobbies in life, and all she wanted to do was have fun and not think about anything. Julia was an only child, so she grew up very spoiled and used it skillfully. The girl went to university at her parents' insistence. They wanted her to get a prestigious profession, and besides they hoped that life in another city and study among smart students would help her become independent. But they were wrong, and Julia had fun as usually. Julia drove slowly, trying to look at everything around her. She was very excited about summer and was already anticipating meeting her friends and relaxing. Her mother met her in the yard and tried to hug Julia, but the daughter only said a dry hello, and that she had no time for all this tenderness because she was in a hurry to see her friends. The mother remained standing outside with a pensive face, upset that her daughter had grown up so defiant. Julia entered the house, set the heavy suitcase down, and saw her father, who greeted her cheerfully as he came out of his office. She greeted him like the mother, and then silently went to her room, ignoring her father's upset look. Julia remembered her childhood, when her father often took her fishing. Her mother also spent a lot of time with her daughter, and then her parents took up their careers, and she missed their attention completely. Now she didn't need anything from them, only their money. An hour later the young woman heard her father calling her to dinner. She quickly changed her clothes, and on the way down she noticed that there were some unknown people sitting at the table. The father introduced Julia to his companion and friend Thomas. The man kissed her hand, which embarrassed the young woman a little. Then her father introduced her to another guest, business partner Michael. Julia looked at him carefully. He had a very unusual appearance. Black as night eyes, but blonde hair. The whole evening she looked and listened only to him, and her father immediately noticed it. When the guests left, he cautioned that although Michael was not married, he was too old for her, and there was no reason to look at him that way. Julia couldn't sleep for a long time thinking about Michael. She realized that she had fallen in love. And she didn't care that he was about 20 years older than she. She had never felt this way before, although she had relationships with men that left no trace in her memory. In the morning, Julia asked her father to buy her a new car, since she no longer liked her current one. Her father's eyes widened in surprise, but he offered to continue the conversation later because he was in a hurry to meet Michael. Julia realized that this was her chance to see him once again. She quickly got ready and drove to her father's office. She stood in front of the entrance and waited for him to come out. After a long time, he showed up and got in his car. The young woman drove slowly behind him with the goal of finding out where he lived. Soon he stopped at the supermarket and came inside. Julia parked beside him and opened the hood and ripped out some kind of hose to fake a breakdown. After about 20 minutes, Michael came out with his shopping. After putting it in the car, he approached Julia, who was diligently working under the hood, and offered to help. The woman smiled and pretended to be here by accident. Michael chuckled good-naturedly and said he saw her driving behind him. Julia smiled and called it a coincidence. The man looked under the hood of the car for a long time, and when he found the hose, he was very surprised how such a breakdown could have happened. Julia shrugged her shoulders, and Michael quickly fixed the defect and was about to leave, so Julia went for broke and invited him to dinner. Michael once again laughed at her self-confidence and, for the last time, tried to get rid of her attention. The man said that he should be the one to invite her to dinner, but he was rushing to get home, where the workers were waiting for him. At these words, without asking permission, Julia got into Michael's car, saying that she really wanted to see what his repairs were. Michael shrugged his shoulders, then got into the car too, and they drove off. The beautiful house was so big that Julia immediately realized that this man was much richer than her father, and she should not miss such a chance. Michael cooked dinner and served drinks. Julia liked him more and more. After dinner she wanted to seem like a very decent girl, so she was going to call a cab, but Michael offered her to stay and promised to give her a separate room. Lying in bed, Julia could not sleep for a long time, and then she got up, went to Michael's room, and silently kissed him. From that day on, their relationship began. The woman often stayed with him overnight, but she acted cunningly. During the day, she diligently examined the house where her lover lived, especially at the books he was reading. It was all to understand Michael and find out all that he loved. And in the evenings, she used to talk to him about these things. Michael began to fall in love with her. It seemed to him that she was special and understood him like no one else. The man had already been married in the past and had been divorced long ago. His ex-wife went abroad and took their daughter, and he had not seen her for 13 years already. 2 months later, Michael's father found out about the relationship of his daughter and was furious, not understanding how Julia dared to meet with his business partner. They had a big fight, and the father ordered her not to come home until she got this love out of her head. Julia only grinned, packed her things, and left for Michael's place. They began to live together, and soon Michael proposed to her. Julia's parents weren't even invited, as Julia didn't want her dad to cause a scandal at the wedding. Now Julia was a wife, and she spent all day shopping with her friends or in a beauty salon. Her husband fulfilled her every whim, but he began to insist that he needed an heir. It had been 2 years since their wedding day. The woman still did not communicate with her parents. She lived for her own pleasure. She bought the most fashionable things, visited clubs where she stayed till morning, and didn't think about anything. One day, her husband left on a business trip for a few days, and Julia was going to throw a party for friends in his absence. But close to noon, the phone rang. She was told that her husband had had an accident and was in the intensive care unit. The woman instantly got ready and went there. Michael was hooked up to various devices. Julia looked at him, and there were no tears or emotion on her face. The doctor said that he was in a coma, and nobody knew if he would be able to come out of it. Julia went outside in shock at what had happened, and suddenly a friend called her and asked about the upcoming party. The woman smiled finally and replied that everything was on. The party lasted until the morning, and then she slept through the evening without worries about her husband. She didn't care how he was. She thought only that if he would die, she would inherit his entire fortune. A few days later, an elderly gardener asked how the master was doing and advised her to talk to him to make him come out of his coma. Upon hearing her voice, Julia became angry and fired him. As time went on, Julia very rarely visited her husband, who was not getting any better. But one day she was asked to come to the hospital urgently. Most of all, she was afraid to hear that her husband was getting better, because she did not want him to go home again. She already had a young lover. To her relief, the doctor told her that there was no improvement and that her husband would probably spend the rest of his life on supportive therapy. Julia looked at the doctor meaningfully and asked if it would be better to disconnect Michael so that he would not suffer and quietly go to the next world. At that very moment, an unknown girl entered the room and said that she would never let that happen. It was Dorothy, Michael's daughter from his first marriage. A week later, Julia was told that her spouse was out of the coma. Julia understood perfectly well that Dorothy would tell him everything, which meant that a divorce could not be avoided. The woman went to her husband to be the first to tell her version of what had happened, but Michael already knew everything, and his lawyers were handling the divorce. Julia packed her things and returned to her parents. She had nowhere else to go. It was unpleasant to realize, but they were right. She had nothing, no education, no rich husband. She stood for a long time and could not enter her father's house. She was ashamed. Finally, she made up her mind. The father opened the door, looking at her intently. "Hi, I'm sorry," was all she could say. He stroked her on the head. "Don't cry, my little girl. Whatever you do, you will still be our daughter. Remember, we love you, and what happened will be a lesson to you." Julia finally realized that only her parents truly loved her, and other people didn't. Her friends disappeared as soon as she ran out of money. Her ex-husband didn't want to know her anymore, but she deserved it. Now Michael spent all his time with his daughter and enjoyed life. Dorothy told him that for years she had believed her mother, who said he didn't want to see her. Fortunately, the gardener found her phone number and told her the whole truth. A year later, Julia returned to her studies and graduated from university. A few years later, she married a simple man whom she truly fell in love with. And married life with Michael was probably just a little piece of life that she had to go through to study important lessons. Now Julia knew for sure that happiness was not about money.